Whether it's the deer hunting world or the deer habitat world, there's a lot of bad deer decisions taking place every single season. And we talk about a lot of them here. We talk about the top failures, top myths, top lies in the industry. And I think sometimes people get confused. Maybe they're misled by other voices in the hunting industry. But there's a lot of things that I talk about that I can be fairly negative about, but they actually have their place. And I asked Dylan when I was making the notes for this video on the whiteboard, and we were discussing this video, and Dylan, I'm going to bug you with that same question at the end of this.
Okay.
So we'll see. In fact, so I remember, I'll put number 8 down here, and we have our mystery number 7. Unless you could buy a vowel, then you'll get this. But I'll put Dylan question down here. So, but all of these that I've mentioned here, you know, really something can be done with these, and we're going to discuss those. I don't want you to think that there's certain things or certain deer habitat improvements that you should never even consider. But when you do consider them, I want you to be fully informed. And that's why we try to have this channel with no agenda, just simply trying to get good information to you, information and experiences to a very high level, very deep level, and deliver that to you so you could find the ultimate level of success. So almost everything has its place if you think about it. I talk about high hinge cuts. What I'm not a fan of are the high hinge cuts that make a virtual trampoline. Trees that are cut, piled on top of each other to create this ultimate deer bed underneath with a cover right here, almost like a trampoline. Deer are going to live there. People are cutting with saws right at their face, and it makes it very, very dangerous. It's a wasted resource because you're putting browse above deer head level, screening and cover above deer head level. But what I see is something that hinge cuts, and you'll see that occasionally where you have a high hinge cut where you can perform safely. If your saw has been maintained and you have your protective gear on and you're skilled with a saw, for you to actually hinge cut something that goes over something else. There's a down tree. You know, a lot of times you have a hinge cut right here or a down tree that is fallen and broken this way. If you hinge, if there's another tree behind it, and you hinge low, when that tree falls, it's gonna pop it right off. It's gonna break right here. So you have to hinge high so it lays over the top of it. And that could be just something you're trying to create more cover down trunk so that deer have side cover and maybe some browse 10, 15 feet away from that stump area. There's a little case for that, but what I see high hinge cuts working for the most, and I've had people be fairly risky with this where they're standing in the back of a side-by-side in the front end loader of a tractor, so I don't recommend those things, but you're using a level of experience and skill that's appropriate for this, but you're creating high hinge cuts just simply for screening. You have the lay of the land, and you have timber falling away, and the slope is falling away, and you want to screen what's on top of that ridge, maybe a food plot or a bedding area, access to a stand location. So you're creating those high hinge cuts, maybe a neighboring boundary marker where you want to create that high visual so that your neighbor that's trying to hunt your land can't shoot into your land. So you're trying to create those high hinge cuts, laying one on top of the other. So there's always a case for that. It's very minuscule. And you can even look at hinge cuts in general. And we recommend hinge cutting 15% of the time at most. There's a lot of other timber harvest activities and timber cuttings, total cuttings, complete cuts, face cuts that you can complete before you need to actually work on hinge cuts, which are more labor intensive and actually a lot more dangerous than traditional logging or timber harvest, while someone else takes the risk and actually puts money in your pocket in that case too. So there is a case for hinge cuts. High hinge cuts even, and I hope that makes sense. And on all these, and I'll get to that Dylan question towards the end, but for someone to say that there's not a case for hinge cuts is really not fully informed or experienced with that subject matter to actually give that opinion, because there's always some type of case. And you know, hinge cuts can be a very valuable tool for putting browse and cover at deer level. Again, not if they're high, except for very few circumstances. Number 3 here, hard mast addition. When I say addition, what does that mean? So we're talking chestnuts, acorns. You're planting that hard mast as a food source. But it can't be the food source on private land. It can't be the only food source. Doesn't matter if it's chestnuts, acorns, it can't be, unless it includes soft mass in that too. Whether it's persimmons, apples, crab apples, pears, whatever it might be, that can't be the only food source on your property. It has to be in addition to a property that already has a great food source, especially on private land where it's a food plot. And then also you have that great daylight browse component back in bedding areas where you have hardwood regeneration, woody shrub tips, briars, where you actually have that woody component that deer will live on during the daylight. Satisfies those 2 feedings out of 5 that take place over a 24-hour period, meaning those 2 that are in their daylight bedding areas, and it satisfies that urge without giving them so much food that they don't have the need to move to that afternoon food source on your property. So once you already have good browse on your property, once you already have those food plots and you have that movements, then I use soft mast as a complement to food plots and hard mast as a complement to bedding areas. And I don't mix up those two, because soft mast, there's a higher value of attraction, higher level of attraction. And you can even throw chestnuts a little bit into that mix too, because they can be very attractive too for a short period of time in the early season. So really, hard mast, I've seen hundreds of trees, thousands of trees planted on a property, tree tubes, they all die 5 years later, but that's not the point. The point is a lot of resources were spent and time to plant and money to spend on those trees to plant them with very little to no return in the end. And you really need to make sure when you are planting these that you actually have the right focus and you're fully informed in going forward. Number 4, miscanthus grass. Miscanthus grass is a really cool planting. It can grow very high in most good soil locations. If you have poor sandy soil, it's a northern climate, you might not get the growth that you're actually expecting. There's a lot of areas where you need very high screening. Either it slopes away from the road, it slopes away from a driveway, from an access trail, you're under power lines, you need that height, but you can't plant conifers, you can't plant something else. For example, switchgrass. It can cost 1/100th of the amount to plant miscanthus, but you're only going to get that 6 to 8 foot height depending on where you're at. And so even though you can get a good wall, good screening, it's very cheap to plant. If you need 12, 14 feet and you want a perennial, then miscanthus grass is the way to go, and especially under power lines. Where you need that height and you can't plant conifers, then miscanthus grass can be a great choice. It's probably the number 1 choice. If you're looking for just an annual, you can get a great screening blend from John Comp, Northwoods Whitetails. That's one of the things he specializes in, his HD screening blend. Great product that he sells, that he's put together, and a really good planting for properties where you need that height, but you don't need that perennial investment, because miscanthus grass is extremely expensive. Most of the time, I think Dylan was on a property recently where it was just another single layer, double layer where you could see right through it. And I had a property that I shared from down south last year. And I think, Dylan, you're the one that told me that, right? You had a property that kind of what we've seen in those videos where you just, it's, you know, and most of the time you hear you want 4 to 5 rows, 12 to 18 inch spacing. And if you don't do that, you're not going to get that wall that you like, even though you have really tall plants growing. Great product, very small application, but doesn't mean it's not right for you. Number 5, hack and squirt and girdling. There's times, especially when you get more to the south, where you're actually taking invasive trees out, whether it's holly or something else, where I've even seen people do this with birch trees, or not birch trees. I've even seen people do this with beech trees, just simply because beech brush is low wildlife value. It's non-browse, it's starvation food to deer, and beech can take over an area, especially when sunlight's exposed and you get all this growth and you can take over other plantings. So you have to kill it, you have to hack and squirt, you have to girdle it. But what I'm looking at is when you have small parcels, 20, 30 acres, you have to be very careful that when you're girdling, when you're hacking and squirting and killing these trees, that you have an exit, you have a plan. I've heard stories of trees falling down and almost killing people because they're girdled. 2 years later, they're rotten, they come down. So you have to be very careful what you're doing and making sure that you're not girdling and hacking squirt the wildlife trees, because that's the typical practice. That's why we talk about it. People are hacking and squirting box elder, aspen, low value trees that have high wildlife value, soft maple even, where they're low value timber trees, but high wildlife value. And that's why it goes back to The higher the timber value on your land, likely the lower the wildlife value. I'd rather buy a cheaper, uglier parcel with poor habitat but have great wildlife on it than have to manage a bunch of trees. Maybe you like to manage trees, but don't complain if you don't have great wildlife. And this is where hack and squirt goes wrong, is when people are hacking and squirt and girdling the wrong trees at the wrong time that relate to deer habitat and their overall goals. They're creating typically the opportunity for more timber and higher timber value in that area, or releasing oaks, for example, that create an oak savanna where there's very low wildlife value, than actually meeting the goals of the landowner. Number 6, soybeans and sugar beets. I like soybeans and sugar beets. They're great. I've had clients plant sugar beets at a very high volume, getting 4 or 5 tons out of a 1/4 acre planting. But it's fenced, it's watered, irrigated, the deer kept off it. There's a lot of ifs to make sure that you get it right. And the same as with soybeans. The number one food plot failure that we see every year are soybeans, just simply because they're eaten down to the dirt. There's some great success. Food plots rotated with rye and wheat, easy to plant. We've done that with a cultipacker in the past. I've written about that back all the way as early as 2014 and 2012, showing people how to plant no-till food plots and soybeans without using big equipment or grain drills. Very easy to do with rye or wheat, and complete that rotation. Done that on my own property. It's in my food plot book from 2014. So it's something you can check out, but really soybeans can be an incredible magnet. But if it's the only game in town, it's all you have, then you failed to actually attract a herd and build a herd for the entire hunting season, because typically those soybeans aren't hit very hard unless you're in a high deer density area, which isn't necessarily a good thing. They're not hit hard until December. So you miss the entire season, or they're down to the dirt. But there is a place for them when you already have a food plot program in place, when you can protect those during the summer growing months. You're not producing a doe factory, placing excessive does and fawns and high numbers of deer and non-antler deer on your property during the summertime to only stay during the fall. Then soybeans can be that great addition to an otherwise already good food plot program. It's not the foundation of a food plot program, but it can be that upper third of the triangle that will help you lead to success. And it's the same with sugar beets. Sugar beets to me are even more browsed by deer and less browse tolerant. So think about those two. There's a great place for them. They're a great complement to an otherwise good food plot program, but they're not the end game themselves. Number 7, you've probably solved the puzzle at this point, but food plots. Food plots are, of course, something we recommend to all our clients, all our private land clients. There's been a handful of times and we're talking less than 1% of the time, probably about 1/4% of the time. I'm trying to even think back, just literally a handful. On one hand, I can count times we're not recommending food plots just because simply they didn't have the land for it. They didn't have the space for it. And typically there's bait piles involved in those states. And there's something that can be treated like a food plot that will help define the deer movement in the area. But where we see food plots go wrong is simply you're creating a nocturnal parcel. And then you're not creating a good herd. In fact, you're diminishing the herd in most cases. You're not creating a good hunt, and you're wasting a lot of dollars and resources. But if you do it right and you create daylight food plots that complement daylight bedding areas, and you can hunt that movement, then you're creating morning stands, evening stands, and that's how it's done. So food plots can be the number one attraction and foundation deer habitat piece on your entire parcel. But if you're doing it wrong, it could also destroy your land. So example of, and most of the time, unfortunately, guys out there, this using food plots, most of the time people use them incorrectly. They really hurt a lot of parcels. And that's why we spend so much time talking about food plots and how to do it right. And Dylan, I talked about all these bad deer habitat turn good. And one of the things I asked Dylan at the beginning of this was, Dylan, and I actually couldn't, but Dylan, can you think of anything that you hear being used out there that that would be more of a somewhat accepted habitat practice that no one should be using, that doesn't have its place in the deer world?
No, I couldn't think of any good habitat ones because I feel like there are so many exceptions. You know, there's always an instance where, well, you know, that might be the fix here. You know, I think, but a lot of times people are trying to take one of your phrases is put a square peg in a round hole and use some of these just the wrong way, thinking that it's going to, be the game changer on their property, when really it's such a small sect of, the habitat world that a lot of these are used for.
Right, and I see that too. I start thinking like, I think of, rope mock scrapes, various scent contraption or hiding machines. There's certain things in the deer hunting world that we could probably say really don't have their place.
That's where I got to thinking about product.
But habitat is different.
Things where it's like, okay, we probably shouldn't be using that. But
yeah.
Habitat, it seems like there's always an instance you can find where it is necessary.
Right. I think I talk about we had talked about mock scrapes and the mock vine scrape, and going back how many hundreds of thousands of mock scrapes are out there. There's in some ways or some piece of me, all of a sudden I think, boy, if we could have just attached a product to that and sold that times 500,000 times, but it would have been something that wasn't needed. That's more in the deer hunting world. Again, there's things that in the deer hunting world that definitely are not needed. But when it comes to habitat, like we said with number one here, almost everything has its place, and I think everything does that's generally accepted. I mean, there's some weird things out there that people try, some more gimmick things. Always think about, if someone is telling you that you need to do this, think, how does it fit? When does it not work? Because there's always a place that it doesn't work. Even food plots that we recommend all the time. When does it not work? When does it work? Understand both ways, because you can't understand one way unless you understand the other way. People say hinge cuts don't work, but they don't understand when they do. And that's part of the problem. They need to understand both ways. And then at the same time, is someone making money off of this recommendation that they are telling you need to plant, grow, or manipulate on your land this year? Because if it's only one-sided and they're making money from it, you might want to run. That's generally a good test to see if that's something that you should be using on your land. But really, again, when it comes to deer habitat, there's a place for everything. And I hope if you use one of these products, you find the perfect fit on your land and it brings you great success this fall. Folks, I want to make sure you check out my web class video series, whether it's how to design your food plot program or how to design your property in general. And we have a new one coming out that'll be how to hunt the rut. But these bucks back here are a testament. Some of these bucks go back to 93. They're even in different states. I urge you to check out those web classes so that you can help yourself, help your land, help your hunt. The link is in the description. And also for those that have tried them out, I encourage you to offer some feedback in the comments below. Thank you.